Hello, this is the RPGPundit, and today I'm presenting you with a review of the Fantasy Trip Legacy Edition, the box set. That octopus dude there. Alright, so those of you who are already following my my channel will know that a couple of weeks ago I received this box set here, which has all this stuff and more in it, as an anonymous gift. I think it may have been connected to the fact that this is published, as you can see here, by Steve Jackson Games. And Steve Jackson Games is currently involved, or one of those involved, in a somewhat of a controversy about the Labyrinth Lords Frog God games. The company is threatening to sue some people who have been trying to stop a deal that Steve Jackson made with Frog God. Uh-oh. 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 Chunga, 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 chunga. Look at this. Look at who shows up. Come on. Okay, come on. Come on, you can make it, fatty. Come on, that's it. Good job, big chungas. Now you're in a box. Look at you. Good job. Good job, you did it. You made the gargantuan effort of moving your massive bulk, and you got into the box just like you wanted. Congratulations. My cat. One of my two cats. Anyway, she's always coming to cause trouble, and I guess she couldn't resist the open box. Alright, so the thing is, anyways, that I received this review copy. I think it was to get me talking about that subject. That subject's pretty much closed at this point, but I did an unboxing video when I first got this product. And if you want to see all the details of all the stuff that's inside, here you're going to get glimpses. But if you want a detailed look at that, go back and check out that unboxing video. If I remember, I'll put it in the description of this video. It's worth checking out. The basic summary, though, is you get a crap load of stuff, and it's well worth it. I mean, you see the size. This is a giant cat-sized box, right? A box that will comfortably accommodate the big chungas here, and so it's full of stuff. Today I'm going to focus on reviewing the product itself and what it's about. For those of you who don't know, the Fantasy Trip was one of the early RPGs. And it wasn't one of the earliest. It began its history, you could say, in 1979, 1980, and then the thing that made kind of the Fantasy Trip special was a couple of details. The first is that it was the first RPG product Steve Jackson ever made. He'd made a couple of war games before that, like I think Car Wars was before that. But he hadn't done an RPG until this. And Steve Jackson, those of you who are familiar with RPGs will know, he was the one who also did GURPS, the Generic Universal Role-Playing System, which is a very popular role-playing system. It was more popular in the past, but where are you going? What? Ah! You messed up my whole display, damn it! Now, where did you killed one of the little guys I had here? Look at that. There was a little figure. This comes with the product, right? There's a little figure, got stepped on by a cat. Now he's dead. I'll get back to that later. Anyway, oh yeah. So Steve Jackson made GURPS, very popular role-playing game. But those of you who are maybe not just gamers, or maybe never gamed anything other than D&D, will probably recognize Steve Jackson from games like Munchkin and Illuminati, which are, hugely famous today. So this was one of his earliest products, and he did it for a company that he didn't control, and that company went out of business, and he didn't manage to save the rights to the Fantasy Trip, and so the game was not published again in 35 years. This edition now, the Legacy Edition that has just come out as a result of a Kickstarter, is the first new version of the Fantasy Trip ever, besides the original games, which quickly became rarities and collector's items. So this is part of it's got a lot of fame. Now, does it live up to that fame? Is it actually a great game? Or is it just that combination of nostalgia and rarity that made the Fantasy Trip so renowned? I'm going to try to look beyond just the ridiculously cool amount of stuff that it gives you in this set to analyze, is the game itself any good? So for starters, you've got, this is the actual rules of the RPG itself, the fantasy trip in the labyrinth. That's one of the many things that come in this box set. But before we get to there, I'm going to point out, this here, that's the DM screen. I love the octopus. Originally, before there was the fantasy trip, there were these two games, Mewe and Wizard. And they were both these kind of war games where you played in a little labyrinth in a little dungeon sort of area. That's where these figures come from. They're cardboard cutout figures, and you went along in hex maps, and you fought each other. And it basically was a multiplayer game where typically you'd be fighting the other people. You make a warrior in Mewe or a wizard in Wizard, and then you would have them fight. But you could also, they also included some monsters that could be fought as well, in part because in Wizard you could summon monsters if you were a wizard to fight with. So these two boxes, and this one here, which was a supplement for Mewe and Wizard, come in this product. And so you get the complete games, which are, again, not RPGs, but war games, that come with the product. From those same rules, those core rules that were in these books, the next thing that came out was In the Labyrinth, which adjusted the Mewe and Wizard rules into a full-blown role-playing game. And the interesting thing about this is that there's certain things that the fantasy trip is supposed to be well known for. I mean, one thing was that its maps were all made out of hexagrams and mega hexes. So if you look at a fantasy trip map, let me see if I can find one here real quick. The maps in the fantasy trip of the actual dungeons, I mean, they're not like a line graph map like D&D maps have. They're all hexagrams, right? Which is kind of strange. But besides that, mechanically, the thing that they were probably that the fantasy trip was probably most renowned for is the idea that it was the first RPG that used a completely non-random system of character creation. That is to say, basically, it was the invention of point buy. Now, if you guys know my my own preferences from reading my past reviews or watching my past reviews, you would know that I am not in any way a big fan of point buy mechanics. I don't care for them. So you would think, obviously, that this may be not a good sign for the likelihood that I'm going to give this a good review. However, I'm going to explain a few details before I actually get around to talking about my preferences. I think we need to look at how that came about. It's very interesting, because I didn't know this until I actually got a chance to read Mewe and Wizard and then In the Labyrinth, and then it all made perfect sense. The thing is, point buy was not common in role-playing games. It wasn't used in role-playing games up until this point, up until the early, the very end of the 70s. And the fantasy trip may very well have been the very first product to use it. But they were super common. It was super common to use point buy in war games, right? If you were playing miniature war games in the 1970s, what you'd usually have is armies that you would buy with points. You'd have X amount of points, just like you still have nowadays if you play Warhammer or Warhammer 40K, right? You have an X point value army that you put together. You can put together however you want, but it has to add up in terms of their abilities to that level of points. And that was a very common thing in war games. Curiously, when the first war game to RPG adaptation, Chainmail into Dungeons and Dragons, when that happened, the point buy did not appear there. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you ended up having a random character generation system, and that kind of made the influence for everything else. scoot ahead 6 years later when the fantasy trip is invented. And the thing with the fantasy trip is it was all being made by the same company, right? And you had this product, Mewe, and then Wizard, which is basically the same. They already had the rules for combat. And they had all the basic part of the rules for character creations. The Indie Labyrinth added a little bit more about that, because the character creation part here was mostly just the stats needed for doing combat with. But since this was already point buy, this had to be point buy. Or otherwise, it would have changed everything too radically. In other words, the introduction of point buy into RPGs was an accident. It wasn't that Steve Jackson thought, I'm going to make an RPG and it's going to use point buy. It's that he said, I'm going to make a skirmish fighting game, a war game that's going to use point buy, like hundreds of other war games used. And then he said, I'm going to change that war game into an RPG, and it's already got the point buy. But it's not that it was an intentional innovation. So in some ways, the fantasy trip is credited as kind of a great idea when it was really more of an accident to do that. And of course, in my point of view, it has a lot to answer for because it had a bad influence in the future. At the same time, there is something in the fantasy trip in terms of rules that I think is actually vastly more important in terms of innovation and shows you how clever Steve Jackson was. So let's go through this bit by bit here. There's a lot of stuff in the book, as you can see, on making, the general guides of how to game master, all that sort of thing. The art is all new, but the rules are pretty much as they were before. So to cover in this game, this is the basic character class, the basic character sheet rather. And those of you who know GURPS will notice this. You'll see it. It'll probably seem very familiar to you. Strength, Dex, IQ, and movement. You have your health points is basically your strength. Strength also determines what type of weapons you can use, how much damage you can do basically. Dexterity is the basis of all your checks for attacks or for I believe for any kind of offensive spells. IQ is your check for knowledge of all kinds. It also determines how many talents, that is to say skills or abilities, you're going to have. And you can see otherwise it's super simple, right? This is the one side. These come with the book too, right? A big block of these. These are double 2 on one page, but there's also like 3 more booklets that are all on a single page. And I guess you just put the talents and spells in the back. And so you can see the simplicity of the system. It's a very simple system. Those of you who have played GURPS will find it immediately familiar. In the game, you start with 8 points in each of the top 3 attributes. And then you can add to that, so 8 and 8 and 8 is 24, right? And you have 8 more points that you can distribute however you want between these 3. So that adds up to 32. That's a 32-point character. When you build your character, you'd have to decide if he's a fighter or a wizard. Those are the only 2 broad classes. However, depending on how you make your guy, because there aren't, strictly speaking, levels in the game, and so you don't go up by level, you can make your character a variety of things, right? A fighter can be a leader, a barbarian, a horseman, a mercenary, blah, blah, blah. You can have characters that the wizard can be like a fighter wizard, an adept, a commercial wizard, a wizard thief. And you can have stuff in between, right? Like a guy who's more of a thief. So you could have a wizard thief or you could have a fighter thief, either way. There's also, and this is to me the great saving grace of this book, a table of random generation for characters, which would let you vastly, I think, speed up the process. It doesn't do everything for you, which is actually kind of, oh God, not you again, which is actually kind of good. But it gives you a bunch of features that you can begin to use from there. Quiet. No, shut up. That you can begin to use from there and then apply into everything. My cat is determined to disrupt this review. And I fed them just before this, so it's not that. Oh, she's purring. So this is the basic of character creation, right? And then if you're a wizard, you get spells. The spells, you get a number of spells that are equal to your IQ points. And you also get a limit of a maximum IQ of how many spells you can cast, right? So if your IQ was only 9, like there's no minimum to be a wizard. I mean, I guess nobody can have an attribute below 8. And if your IQ is only 9, you could only pick the IQ 8 or IQ 9 spells to take, right? If your IQ is higher, you can pick higher stuff. And you'll notice that in some cases the IQ can go up to, here the IQ can end up going up to IQ 20 spells. That's because later on, instead of having experience points and leveling in this game, you get experience points that you then spend that will let you either raise your ability scores. If you're a wizard, get new spells. In fact, if you're not a wizard, you can also get spells, but it costs you triple. So it would cost you 3 of your IQ point value for buying stuff at character creation instead of 1. Then you have talents, which are what everybody else can use besides wizards. They also have an IQ level, so if your IQ is, only 8, you can only buy talents that are for 7 or 8 IQ. Wizards can also learn talents, but it costs them 2 points instead, which is quite a cost, I think, for the purchasing of stuff that also means they have 1 less spell. There's all kinds of special talents, which include some of things that are like skill type talents, right? And if you're a fighter, you have to take, well, you don't have to take it, but there are weapon proficiencies, so to say. And if you don't have a proficiency in a weapon, you get a penalty when you make to your dex roll when you're making attacks with them. There's also special maneuvers like quick draw weapons. So there's some stuff here that I don't think would have shown up before the fantasy trip, and it shows some of the innovation. And this is stuff that, at the same time, you can definitely see how a few years later, every game had this. But at the time, there would have been quite some innovative details to this sort of stuff. The world of the fantasy trip is like a fantasy sci-fi setting that it's mostly fantasy, but it has high-tech stuff in it. In theory, the world is gigantic and there could be almost anything in it. So there are high-tech things, so you have skills like mechanician and stuff. The book goes on to show you how it ways to randomly design a labyrinth. Here's a little card that came with the thing that lets you random roll for quick treasure. You've got random outdoor encounters and outdoor actions and activities. There's rules here. This is not something that would have been new by then. I mean, there would have been lots of other games that would have had this sort of thing, but you have stuff like rules on joining a thieves guild, a mercenaries guild, how to hold legal cases. There are obviously rules on equipment and stuff. I think it's funny that something that GURPS also kept is that instead of putting like 20 gold pieces, it's just a $sign and a 20 after it, right? I think those are supposed to be, somewhere it mentions that the default is a silver piece and that the $sign means a silver piece, right? So there's lots of mechanics for handling every sort of thing, rules for traps. I'm going to get to say now how the mechanics are resolved. In almost every case, the resolution, which will be familiar to anyone from... Oh, quiet you. Which will be familiar to anyone from GURPS, is that you roll 3d6 and you have to get equal or less than your attributes. So for example, if you are this guy and you have a 19 IQ, that means that you're going to succeed probably almost every time, right? There are some exceptions, however. And the reason for that is that, first of all, there are some rolls that will always succeed, and there are some rolls that will always fail. This is the inside of the master's screen. As you can see, for example, in combat, there are results that can say always succeeds, always fails, etc. And in general, that's how it works. It's very simple. 3d6 versus the ability score. So a critical is when you actually get really low, right? Like if you end up rolling on 3d6 a 3, that's a critical, whereas an 18 would be a botch, right? And an 18 will always miss, and a 3 will always hit, and most of the times a 3 or 4 will always hit. But now here's the part that I think is really, really innovative about that mechanic, which is that in the fantasy trip, if you're doing something that is meant to be hard for you, or that you don't have, that's an extra difficult task, or that you don't have the prerequisite ability, then instead of rolling 3 dice, you roll 4 dice, or sometimes 5, and you have to get equal or less than your ability score. If you're doing something that's really easy for you, or that you have some kind of benefit, then you roll 1 less dice. So you might roll 2 dice instead of 3. Or if you're, let's say you have a really complex trap that you need to roll 5 dice against your dexterity to succeed. But you have the requisite thief skills to disarm traps, the mechanician skill. And so because of that, you end up rolling 1 less for every level of mechanician you have. So if the trap is extra hard, it's not a 3d6, it's not a 4d6, but a 5d6 trap, but you have 1 rank in mechanician, you reduce it by 1, and you're only rolling 4 dice against your ability score. That's something that I'm pretty sure had never been thought up before. And it's something obviously now that you think is really common, this idea of adding bonus or penalty dice to the check, right? It's even similar in some ways to advantage and disadvantage in 5th edition. Now, D&D didn't come up with that until 5th edition, right? But this guy, Steve Jackson, came up with it in 1979. So that's, I think, the thing that you really have to credit. Like, if you want to say that there was one thing that was a really innovative twist in the fantasy trip, that was also intentional, because I guess Point Buy was innovative, but I think it was mostly bad, and it wasn't intentional. But what was innovative and intentional was that idea of scaling up and down on the dice rolled to resolve things. It's very, very clever. I'll note that in the game, you'll have the default setup is that you're playing with tiles, and the good news is the box comes with all kinds of interchangeable tiles, sometimes like these big ones with 3 here, or you could just get there are some that are single ones, there are some that are single little tiles. Some of them, as you can see, have decorations, some of them are plain. So I just put these here just as an example, and there's lots of figurines that you can use. So you've got a warrior, here you have the other warrior that was sadly killed by Big Chungus when she moved through there. and then here, just to give you an example, is a monster that is a giant, right? So it occupies, I think it's meant to be an ogre or something, but it occupies 3 hexes, right? So there's all kinds of rules for handling this. Now, could you play the fantasy trip with the theater of the mind? Yes, you absolutely could. But you'd have to kind of visualize the process, because in fact, even the movement, the MA score, that's the number of hexes you can move in 1 round if you're not doing anything else, right? So even the movement is expressed in number of hexes. but you could almost certainly not use these. I think the thing is that with all the little figures, with all the interchangeable hexagrams, it is kind of cool. And I'm a guy who has never used hexagrams or or any kind of floor mat or miniatures of any kind, right? But this makes it easy, and it makes it interchangeable, it makes it fun. So it's pretty clever. Combat rules are not super complicated. I think they're just the right level, and you get kind of an expanded version, actually, of the combat rules in the later back of the book that covers almost any occasion of something that you might want to think of, right? There's like unusual weapons and armor. Facing is important. There you have an example of a dragon, I guess, that is in a 7-hex dragon. So that is a giant. Okay, a 4-hex dragon. Monster stats are provided. Some of the one of the big criticisms I'd give is the artwork. I'm guessing these are drawings either of employees at Steve Jackson Game or of Kickstarter supporters that paid a certain amount of money to have their picture in it. It's god awful. Like, really. I mean, there's some art here that's very nice, some that's just all right. This is okay, for example. But any of the ones where it has like the head of a big nerd there in like some outfit, and it totally it just ruins the whole look, right? So there's thrown weapons, missile weapons, all this sort of stuff. Everything you need is in here. In combat, you take damage to your strength points. Same thing when you cast spells, you take damage to your strength points. Your dexterity is what determines your ability to attack. Casting spells damages your strength points, but it's recovered faster. You can also, there are different types of ways to engage. So a regular attack, a ranged attack, obviously, or hand-to-hand combat. What they call hand-to-hand is basically this: is you're grappling with daggers and stuff like that. I think that anybody will find that the rules for combat are pretty complete, and they're also basically very easy to learn. Like, they have a lot of details for special cases, but the basic rule is just right here. This is it, right? You're either engaged, disengaged, or in hand-to-hand, and in your turn, these are the things you can do when it is your turn, right? Here's the order of combat, right? Like, you roll for initiative, renew spells, movement, actions, forced retreats, and post-turn damage. And then here, if you're not engaged, okay, so you can move up to your full movement attacks, you can do a charging attack, you can dodge. Everything is really laid out. And in fact, a DM, unless something unusual happens in the combat and the DM has to kind of go look it up in the book, the DM's screen basically gives you all you need to learn the basic of how to handle the game, okay? The game itself is fairly lethal, I would say. I'd say it's probably low-level D&D style lethal. Because remember, it was originally made as this kind of fighting game where it was assumed your character wasn't going to live, right? There are some things in the fantasy trip, like some magic and stuff that can help mitigate some of that damage, that level of lethality. The interesting thing is, as you get higher in level, you become certainly more competent, but you're always kind of much more at risk. It's a much more rules, not rules light, but it's much less scaled than Dungeons and Dragons, right? In Dungeons and Dragons, there's a huge difference between a first level and a 20th level character, and one of those huge differences is that a 20th level character is probably never going to die, right? Like, it would take something really remarkable to kill them off, and especially to kill them off permanently. So, it's highly, the lethality risk of a 20th level character is much, much lower than the lethality risk of a first level character. In the fantasy trip, I think that risk range doesn't change so much. Like, a higher level character is obviously going to have the potential to kick the crap out of a low level character. depending on what they've taken, obviously, and what have you. But if they get swarmed by a bunch of low-level characters, they'll probably die. You know, just like in a war game, if you have a commander unit that might have good stats, but if it gets overwhelmed by numbers, it's probably done. So it's a very different style in that sense. I think that's basically most of what I have to say. I think the product is really great. I think as an alternative to D&D, the Fantasy Trip is actually quite worth it. Like, it's really a great game, and that's not just nostalgia speaking, because I had no real nostalgia for the Fantasy Trip. I never played it in the old days, and I wasn't really familiar with it until many years after the old school period ended, because it just never, it was already gone by the time I was seriously getting into D&D. So I would say you can check out the Fantasy Trip if what you want is a game that has all the same kind of old school feel that playing old school D&D has, but you want it to be a different sort of experience. If you like point-buy games more than randomly rolled games, you'll probably like the Fantasy Trip better than a lot of OSR games, old school Renaissance games, where the emphasis is put on randomness for character creation. If you like games that have an emphasis on, using minis and hex maps and this sort of thing, if you want there to be more of that strategic element, which a lot of OSR games don't have by default, that might be a good reason to go with the Fantasy Trip. If what you want also is a game that is very light, like it especially if you use those quick roll-up rules, you could make a character very quickly and get to playing. And that's true to some extent with all OSR games, but in a sense, that and kind of the packaging and the look of it and the little figurines and all of this whole deal, it all adds up to something that, for example, could be a really useful thing to do as a one-shot game at a party or something like that. People want to play something, you don't want to take the time if you're if you're a 5th edition or anything above 2nd edition, even 2nd edition, you don't want to take the time to have to roll up really complex characters. You just want to have like a dungeon crawling adventure. That is really what the Fantasy Trip is mainly made for. I guess labyrinth crawling, but you know what I mean, right? Like it's much more focused on that. And that's not to say that you couldn't do a campaign of the Fantasy Trip that went beyond that, right? But it is in a sense a much more primitive. It is primitive even for its time, even for 1980. This would have seemed old school compared to other stuff that was starting to come out at that point that was way more tending towards the innovative in terms of focusing more on setting. The Fantasy Trip has a setting. It mentions it. It tells you a little bit of detail about it. The monsters are very interesting in some cases, the ones that aren't, just the generic ones. But it's still really the game. A lot of the game is going to be much more focused on the dungeon crawl, right, or the labyrinth crawl, and that makes it a good game to have kind of as a backup game. Let's say if you're running a D&D game or something like that, and some of your players don't show up, and rather than play the game underhand, with undermanned, you end up saying, well, let's play some of the Fantasy Trip, right? That's the kind of thing I think it would really work well in. So there you go. And people who won't like the Fantasy Trip, well, if dungeon crawling is not your thing at all, then probably you won't care for the Fantasy Trip. If you don't like games that have that more kind of war gamey old school feel to them, you probably won't like it. If you despise point buy more than me, which is hard, then you might that might be a step too far. But I mean, like this even won me over, so that says a lot. I mean, the point buy is mostly harmless here. It's the tough part is if somebody is going to, in character creation, spend too much time picking their spells and abilities, and a DM can kind of just speed them up through that. Especially with the quick roll stuff, it'll kind of guide you on what things to take, and then you get going with that. So it's not the worst point buy I've ever seen. And the mechanics are good. The mechanics are really good. I think that on the whole, I give this this product a big thumbs up on the whole. I would say for the package and the the overall the stuff that you get for it, it is remarkably nice. The rules are great within the context of what they were, right? What they are. The internal art is mixed. I'm gonna say that. If there's one like real ugly part, I'd say some of the artwork, which I think was service to Kickstarter patrons or something like that, is not good. But in every other respect, I would certainly recommend it. Especially if you're already a fan of kind of the fantasy trip. If you want an alternative to like Steve Jackson's Dungeon Fantasy, for example, which I believe is a similar sort of thing, which kind of it took GURPS and just made it into a dungeon crawling game. I bet you this is like a much lighter rules version of the same that'll be much more playable in a quick, succession. So give that a thought. And I guess that's everything for today. If you like this review, then feel free to share it everywhere you want to. If you like, check out the rest of my videos. I do a lot of stuff other than reviewing, so if you've only come here for the review, you might be a little surprised by some of my other videos. But if you like what you see, please click the subscribe button, click the notifications. I will be doing more reviews as time goes by. People send me review products. I've already got another review product that's going to be coming fairly soon. I'm not going to say which one yet. It's probably one that none of you will know, but it'll be interesting. So click subscribe, click the notification bell if you want to keep updated. If you want to support me, then check out the link for the RPG Pundit Presents series, where you will be able to get, there's like now 77, I believe, different RPG Pundit Presents products. The latest one was as of this filming, is the Grand Floating City of Lowell, which is a science fantasy domed city full of, in the midst of a civil war between revolutionaries and authoritarians and crazy wizards and cultists and techno walruses and a bunch of other stuff, right? Like it's a kind of gonzo fantasy, sci-fi, science fantasy sort of setting. And if you don't like that, there's a bunch of other stuff. There's medieval authentic stuff. Any of the RPG Pundit Presents PDFs are somewhere between 99 cents and I think $3.99. So it's a way to send me a tip and to get something that you might find useful for your RPGing in return. So check that out. If you really want to support me on Patreon, I also have a Patreon page. Very few people do. But if not, check that out, or check out my other RPG products. The links are going to be in the descriptions. If you want something that's much more heavy role-playing than the Fantasy Trip, and that is much more medieval authentic, also check out my Lion and Dragon RPG. But most of all, beyond everything else, share the video. Let everybody else see what there is to see about the Fantasy Trip, and get them to know about this channel in that way. That's a huge help to me. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who subscribed recently. We're almost at 1,100 subscribers at this point, if not past it now. We might be past it already. Yeah, I think so. I seem to remember this morning I saw 1,103. So we're well on the way to 2,000 already, guys. Thank you so much to all of you who subscribed. Keep spreading the message. Currently smoking Lorenzetti Volcano plus Cornell and Deal's Morning Drive.